great to be with you and join with you from across the bridge. And I just want to briefly reflect on lockdown and why I think kind of moving out of lockdown, building the bigger table is really key. And I want to just give a caveat at the start, actually, that when I use the term church, please don't stone me, but what I simply mean is where God's people gather, whether that's a missional community, a coffee shop, a prison, or more of our traditional churches. It's where God's people gather together. And so I just want to explore a couple of things with you this evening. And the first is John 13. I won't read it because you've all got your computers up and can look it up. But in it, we see the very heart of Jesus. He gathers for a final time his close friends. He gets them at a table. He wraps a towel round his waist and he washes their feet. He assumes the posture of a servant. Much has been preached and written and shared about that. For me, the one thing that I want to draw out is that the writer takes note that Judas is at the meal, the disciple who would soon betray Jesus. And that makes Jesus' act of service even more radical. It's a counterintuitive kindness. And I believe it's a living parable for us, a reminder that we are not just to be foot washers to those that we deem worthy or those who are like us, but also for those who we're offended by, angered by, disagree with, those who we're not inclined to welcome at all. And this kind of lavish acceptance is something people are craving for. It's a hospitality around a table. I love eating. I have to admit, I just love sharing a meal with people. It's something very powerful, and I'm always related to Jesus's table ministry. And as we come out of post-lockdown, how can we have the backdrop of radical hospitality in how we consider to rebuild, how we consider to move forward? Well, I think one thing that we've kind of learned on the job is seizing those God moments. I encourage you right now to seize God's momentum. What do I mean by that? And I sit in regional ministry and I do mission over here in South Wales. And one thing that breaks my heart a little bit that I see all across this nation and other nations is our focus is on how we get back into the building. How can we get around the not singing? How can we do this? How can we do that? And the motives are pure and the motives are wonderful. I wonder, though, if I can encourage you to pause and listen. Because I'm not going to lie to you, I don't think there is a new normal. I think the culture in which we live is always going to be changing. And we as a church have proved to ourselves, locally and nationally, that we can change and change at a fast rate when we need to, something which I never managed to get done in pastoral ministry. I want us to ask the question, not how do we get through this next phase, but how do we start with an expectation that change is constant, and what is God's momentum within that? Focus is another lesson in the post-lockdown church. Allocating time and energy and resources into people is the highest importance. You know what it's like, don't you, when you go to your mates for dinner? You got those close mates where you can take your shoes off and relax. And it doesn't matter whether you're eating the best steak or beans on toast. It's about the company. And that's hospitality. How can we build back with that as our focus and allow all our time and energy and resources into making that happen. This kind of thing takes courage, because when you acknowledge that change is here to stay, then that disrupted church life means that we have to risk take. Now, we've been risk taking for years as a denomination, but actually individually as churches and ministers, we have been risk taking. One of my favourite films is Toy Story. I would even go to say I've got an unhealthy obsession with the films. But this image is a clip that is so key to me. Because at the start of the film, if you don't know it, forgive me if you do, Woody's a bit pushed out because Buzz Lightyear's turned up. And he says, I can fly, and he jumps off the bed and he falls on a ball and then everything else, and he says, I can fly. And Woody says, that's not flying, it's just falling with style. And at the end of the first film, and they need to get back into Andy's car, you can tell I'm unhealthily obsessed because I'm spending longer on this than I did on the Bible passage. But at the end of the film, they're trying to get to Andy's car, and he says, Buzz, you're flying. And he says, this isn't flying, it's falling with style. Maybe over the past year, you felt like you are falling, but believe me, friends, you have done it with style, whether you've intended to or not. And how do we keep doing that? How do we keep just allowing ourselves to go with creativity and not fear the failure of falling, but fall with style? And of course, when we do that, we build a bigger table with empathy and compassion. And that's going to be key as we build back in the post-lockdown church. I believe right now, hospitality has to be a key for our communities, because as we share a table together, whether that's coffee or a meal, we take part in listening and open discussions. We begin to bless not just our churches, but our communities. One thing COVID robbed from us was hospitality. I live on my own, and I love living on my own, but it struck me. I went nearly a year without sharing a meal with anyone. That was great, there was more food for me. But there's something, isn't there, about that social interaction that COVID's robbed us with. And so I want to encourage you, as you build back, as you're asking the questions now, what does our worship look like? Have hospitality at the heart of every decision you make. That may mean you end up with something very similar to what you had before. It may be that it's something radically different. But allow yourself to question, what would it look like if we prioritize and focus those that we don't readily associate with in our coming back? If Jesus made room for Judas at that very important meal, his last meal with his mates, how are we going to provide spaces for those Judases in our lives and communities when we choose to have our first meal back together? And as you grapple with the uncertainty, I just want to encourage you not to get stuck in a linear thinking, which can be good, but instead, actually it can't, I'm just saying that to be polite. Don't get stuck in linear thinking. Instead, explore the multiple ways of extending God's kingdom. Because when we listen, when we build a bigger table, when we have the other at the heart of everything we do, we start to mirror the radical hospitality of Jesus. And when we do that, you and I have to be ready to give an answer to why. There are people out there craving someone to listen, craving an authentic community to spend time with and join. And you and I can introduce people to the Saviour of the world. Don't get stuck in a linear way of thinking, but embrace a bigger table.